If I discovered Nisekoi for the first time today, I'm not completely sure I would finish it. I'd probably recognize the harem setup almost immediately. See the childhood promise mystery coming from a mile away, and start getting impatient every time the story found another excuse to delay an obvious romantic development. But I didn't watch Nisekoi today. I watched it when I was around 15 or 16, before I had seen enough romance anime to recognize every trick being used on me. And at that age, those same cliches didn't feel tired at all. They felt exciting. I didn't watch the series exactly when it released in 2014, but I was still young enough that romance anime felt relatively new to me. I can't even remember many romance shows I had watched before it, which probably matters more than I realized at the time. There's a strange advantage to discovering a genre before you understand its rules. You don't know which character archetype usually loses. You don't notice when a misunderstanding exists mainly to buy the story another episode, and you definitely aren't sitting there comparing every new plot device to 5 other anime that already used it. I was just watching these characters slowly fall into each other's lives, and apparently that was enough to make me want to read the entire manga afterward. Even the basic premise of Nisekoi sounds ridiculous when I explain it now. Raku is the son of a Yakuza family, while Kotogi is connected to a rival gang, and because the relationship between those groups is becoming dangerous, the two of them are pushed into pretending that they're dating. They don't exactly make a convincing couple at first. They clash constantly. Neither of them particularly wants to be in this situation, and now they have to perform this fake romance in front of people who have a very serious reason to believe it. It's one of those setups that only needs a few minutes before you understand exactly what kind of anime you're watching. Two people who don't get along are forced to spend time together. Everyone around them starts treating the relationship as real, and sooner or later, the line between pretending and actually caring about each other is obviously going to become complicated. Today I might look at that and think I've seen variations of it plenty of times. Back then, I wasn't thinking about the mechanics of the trope. I just wanted to know what happened when these two people who clearly irritated each other were forced to keep acting like a couple. And Nisekoi knew how to make that situation entertaining. It could be loud and exaggerated one moment, then suddenly give you a smaller scene where one of the characters reacts in a way that makes you wonder whether something genuine is starting to develop underneath all the comedy. Then there was the locket. Raku carries this pendant because of a promise he made with a girl when he was a child, and somewhere out there is a girl connected to that memory. If they meet again, the idea is that the promise they made all those years ago might finally mean something. That instantly gives the romance a second layer. You're not only watching the relationships forming in the present, you're also trying to solve a small mystery about the past. And when more girls appear with connections that might fit that childhood memory, the question becomes even harder to ignore. Suddenly, every detail feels like it could matter. Every key might mean something, and every new piece of information gives you another reason to keep guessing. I remember that part working on me much more than it probably would now. I wasn't rolling my eyes at the idea of a forgotten childhood promise conveniently returning during high school. I genuinely wanted to know who the girl was, and that's something I find funny looking back, because once you've watched enough romance anime, childhood promises start setting off alarms in your head. You stop seeing them purely as memories between characters and start seeing the writer moving pieces around the board. But when you haven't seen that board yet, the mystery feels real. Looking back at Nisekoi now, there are so many familiar ingredients packed into it that I can almost understand why a modern rewatch might test my patience. You have the childhood connection, multiple girls falling into the romantic orbit of the same guy. Misunderstandings that could sometimes be solved with one honest conversation. Moments that get dangerously close to changing the relationship before something interrupts them, and a protagonist who spends a very long time trying to understand his own feelings. None of that bothered me nearly as much back then, and part of the reason is probably simple. A cliché only feels like a cliché after you've seen enough versions of it to recognize the pattern. The first time a story makes you wonder which girl the protagonist will choose, that question can genuinely carry an entire series. You pick favorites, change your mind, notice tiny interactions, and suddenly, an anime confession feels like it has the emotional weight of a championship final. By the 10th variation of the same setup, you start watching differently. You notice when the story is delaying an answer because the answer would end the central tension. And sometimes, that awareness makes it harder to get completely lost in the romance. That doesn't mean the older experience was stupid. If anything, I miss how easily I could surrender to that kind of story. I noticed that difference recently while watching the quintessential quintuplets, because when the story started using a childhood photograph and a mysterious connection from the past, part of my brain immediately went back to Nisekoi. Instead of only wondering what the answer was, I was also thinking about the type of story device being used and what the writers wanted me to suspect. And I remember feeling that Nisekoi had done that kind of mystery better for me, but I'm not even sure that's a completely fair comparison, because maybe Nisekoi didn't necessarily have some magical advantage. Maybe it simply reached me before I had learned to recognize the trick. If I had watched the quintessential quintuplets at 15 and discovered Nisekoi years later, maybe the roles would be reversed. The photograph might have been the thing I obsessed over first, while the locket would have felt like the familiar version of an idea I already knew. That's one of the weird things about judging anime years later. We like to imagine we are comparing two stories under equal conditions, but we aren't the same viewer every time, and the order matters. The funny part is that I never stopped liking romance anime. What changed is the part of romance that gets me invested. Recently, I watched My Love Story with Yamada-kun, and it hit me in a completely different way. I wasn't watching because I needed a giant mystery about which girl would eventually win. I just liked spending time with the characters and watching the relationship slowly become warmer and more comfortable. Some of those moments felt more heartfelt to me now than a complicated harem setup probably would. A conversation that moves two characters slightly closer together can sometimes do more for me than another dramatic reveal about someone secretly knowing the protagonist when they were 6. That doesn't automatically make newer romance anime better, and it definitely doesn't mean I suddenly need every relationship to be realistic. I still like exaggerated anime nonsense when it's fun. I just think I care more now about whether I believe these two specific people enjoy being around each other. At 15, the question might have been, who is Raku going to choose? Now I'm more interested in, why do I want these two people to stay together after the episode ends? That feels like a small difference, but it changes almost everything about the romance stories that work for me. There's also something about Nisekoi that I appreciate more now than I probably did when I was watching it. The story begins by placing enormous importance on a promise made in childhood. Raku has carried this memory for years, and naturally you assume that discovering the girl connected to it will somehow solve the romantic question waiting at the center of the story. But growing up makes that idea feel a little different. A promise you made as a child can be meaningful without deciding the rest of your life, and the person you imagined when you were younger doesn't automatically have to become the person you love once you actually grow up and start building relationships in the present. And without getting into the ending of the manga here, I think that tension between the memory and the person standing in front of you is probably more interesting to me now than the mystery of the keys ever was. Maybe that's also why Nisekoi feels so tied to a specific age in my head, because the story and the version of me watching it are almost impossible to separate now. I was watching a story about characters trying to understand which childhood feelings were real, while I was still young enough to treat every one of those feelings as enormous. I cared about the mystery. I cared about who would win. And I cared enough to leave the anime behind and keep reading until the manga finally gave me an answer. If I found Nisekoi for the first time now, maybe I'd complain about the pacing. Maybe I'd get tired of the misunderstandings, recognize half the tropes immediately, and wonder why teenage me had so much patience. But teenage me didn't need any of those excuses. He just liked Nisekoi. And maybe I don't need to prove that the anime aged perfectly to still appreciate what it did for me. It arrived before romance anime became a collection of familiar patterns in my head, when a Locket could still feel mysterious, and choosing between two fictional girls somehow felt incredibly important. I don't think Nisekoi would become one of my favorite romance anime if I discovered it today. I'm just glad I discovered it when I did.